The grand chamber stretched for 3 kilometers in every direction, and Daniel Wright stood at its center feeling very small and very alone in his gray suit that looked plain against the elaborate forms of the 73 alien species surrounding him, and watching his every move with eyes and sensors he couldn't even begin to understand, because some of them didn't have eyes at all but something else entirely that perceived him in ways humans hadn't yet figured out. The High Arbiter was a creature made of crystal that pulsed with light, and when it spoke, the translation device in Daniel's ear turned the sounds into flat English words, without emotion or warmth, and the Arbiter said that humanity had violated Protocol 447C by having too many military ships for a junior species, and Daniel felt his heart beat faster, but kept his face calm, because showing fear to these beings would be the worst thing he could do right now. Daniel had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 3 years ever since humanity made first contact with the Ven explorers who showed up in orbit around Mars and changed everything humanity thought it knew about the universe, because suddenly humans weren't alone anymore and there were rules out here in space and hierarchies and protocols that species had followed for thousands of years, while humanity was still figuring out how to not kill itself with nuclear weapons. The Council had been clear from the beginning that Earth was a junior species, and junior species had limitations and restrictions and couldn't just do whatever they wanted because the older species knew better and had been managing the galaxy just fine for centuries before humans showed up with their loud engines and aggressive tendencies and too many weapons for a species so young and foolish. Daniel tried to explain that Earth's 400 ships were old and mostly defensive, and that humans needed them because space was dangerous and there were pirates out in the dark between stars who didn't care about Council rules. But the Kryn representative who had too many arms to count and wore elaborate silk wrappings just made a sound that the translator called laughter and said that 400 warships was unacceptable for a species barely 300 years into space travel. The chamber erupted with sounds and lights as other species joined in to agree that humanity was dangerous and unpredictable and needed to be controlled before they caused problems for everyone else, and Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, but pushed it down because losing his temper here would prove them right about humans being unstable and aggressive. The High Arbiter raised one crystalline appendage, and silence fell instantly across the massive chamber, and it said that Earth had one standard cycle, which was about 14 Earth months, to reduce its military to no more than 50 vessels, and disband most of its armies and submit all weapons, research to Council oversight, and these terms were not negotiable. And Daniel felt his stomach drop because 50 ships couldn't even patrol Earth's solar system properly. Daniel asked what would happen if Earth refused, and the Arbiter's tone made it very clear that the Council would vote on appropriate measures, and everyone in the chamber knew that meant military action, an invasion, an occupation, and Daniel thought about Earth being conquered by aliens who thought they knew what was best for humanity. The vote took less than 10 minutes, and 73 species representing 800 worlds voted yes to enforcing compliance through military force if necessary, and the vote passed unanimously, except for Earth's single vote, which meant nothing against such overwhelming numbers. Daniel was given 48 hours to return home with the Council's demands, and as his shuttle lifted off from the station and turned toward Earth, he had time to think about what had just happened and what it meant for humanity's future, because the Council had essentially declared war whether they realized it or not. The journey back gave Daniel hours to review everything he knew about the Council's military from his 3 years of watching and learning and listening to things he probably wasn't supposed to hear, and he knew they hadn't fought a real war in over 3 centuries since they crushed the last species that refused to obey, and their tactics were old and predictable and designed more to intimidate than to actually fight. But they had numbers and ships by the thousands spread across hundreds of worlds, and even old tactics worked when you had overwhelming force, and Daniel wondered if Earth had any chance at all against such power. When his shuttle entered orbit around Earth, he could see ships moving into defensive positions and supply lines being established and defensive platforms coming online, and someone down there had known this was coming and had started preparing, and that gave Daniel a small spark of hope. The meeting in Geneva was tense, and President Lisa Morgan sat at the head of the conference table looking tired and angry, and around her were admirals and generals and scientists who would help decide if humanity would fight or surrender. Daniel told them everything about the ultimatum, and the 14 months they had to reduce to 50 ships, and Admiral Kyle Henderson, who commanded Earth's defense fleet, just shook his head and said 50 ships wasn't enough to maintain basic security across their settlements and mining operations. Daniel said the council didn't care, because to them humans were children playing with dangerous toys who needed to be disciplined before they hurt themselves or others. Dr. Peter Lawson, who ran Earth's weapons research programs, leaned forward and asked if the council had specified which ships or what classifications, and Daniel realized they hadn't, and just said 50 vessels of any kind. Lawson smiled at that, and Daniel started to understand what the scientist was thinking. Because if the council only cared about numbers, then there might be ways to work within their rules while still building something effective. President Morgan raised her hand and said they needed to be clear about the situation, because the council could field thousands of ships and had production facilities across hundreds of worlds, while Earth had 412 ships counting everything, down to patrol boats, and by every normal measure they were completely outmatched. General Patricia Hayes, who commanded Earth's ground forces, said that was true for conventional measures, but humanity had never been conventional and had a long history of winning fights they shouldn't have survived. President Morgan asked what they were proposing, and Daniel found himself thinking about military history and all the times throughout human history when the underdog found ways to make victory too costly for the stronger power. Daniel said they should comply, and everyone stared at him. But he explained that they would reduce their fleet to 50 ships and disband most armies and submit to oversight exactly as demanded, but in ways the council wouldn't expect, because the council had grown used to species just rolling over. Admiral Henderson asked what would happen next, and Daniel said they would show the council what humanity does best, which is adapt and innovate, and make enemies regret their assumptions. Dr. Lawson was nodding now and said, if the council only specified numbers and not classifications, then there were possibilities for building something unexpected. Daniel said the council had given them 14 months, and that was enough time if they were smart and creative and willing to work in the spaces between the council's rules. President Morgan looked around the table at her advisors and saw determination and anger and fear, but also hope. And she said that Daniel would return to the council and inform them that Earth accepts their terms, while everyone else began working on what they called the compliance protocol. After the meeting, Admiral Henderson pulled Daniel aside and said he hoped Daniel knew what he was doing, because if this didn't work, they would be handing Earth to the aliens on a silver platter. Daniel met his eyes and said the council declared war when they decided humanity was too dangerous to be free. And they just didn't know it yet, and by the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. Henderson asked what exactly would be happening, and Daniel smiled without warmth and said they were going to teach the galaxy an old human lesson about the difference between starting a war and winning one. 3 months had passed since the council gave Earth its ultimatum, and Daniel Wright stood in the observation deck of the orbital command station, watching another ship being towed toward the massive processing facility, where it would supposedly be cut apart for scrap metal and recycled into civilian infrastructure. According to all the official records the council monitors were carefully reviewing. Admiral Kyle Henderson joined him at the viewport and said it was painful to watch the ESS Liberty being decommissioned, because that heavy cruiser had served Earth for 40 years and fought off pirate raids in the Kuiper Belt. But Daniel asked quietly if it was really being scrapped, and Henderson's face stayed neutral, but his mouth twitched slightly as he said that, according to all official records and council monitors, yes, absolutely, it was being destroyed. The Liberty disappeared into the processing facility, but what the council didn't know was that the ship was actually being transported through hidden tunnels to the dark side of the moon, where it would be stripped down and retrofitted and transformed into something the galaxy had never seen before, and somehow, after 3 months, the council still hadn't noticed the deception. Dr. Peter Lawson had started calling it the Shell Game Protocol, because for every ship visibly decommissioned, humanity was secretly building 2 more in hidden shipyards scattered across the solar system, and some were buried deep in asteroid fields, while others hid in Jupiter's storms, and a few were even being constructed in the crushing atmosphere of Venus using new pressure-resistant drones. But the real trick wasn't just hiding ships, because the council would eventually find those, and the real innovation was in what those ships were becoming. Daniel walked to the secure briefing room where Lawson waited with engineers and military strategists, and the walls were covered with display screens showing designs for vessels that looked nothing like traditional human warships. Lawson highlighted one design and said, "Welcome to the future of warfare," and explained that the Council wanted 50 ships, so Earth would give them 50 ships, but nobody said what kind of ships they had to be. The design was called the Warden class, and it was massive at 3 times the size of the Liberty. But it wasn't a traditional warship at all, because instead it was a carrier platform combined with a mobile factory and command. Senator Christine Baker, who was one of the lead engineers, explained that each Warden could deploy and maintain 500 autonomous combat drones, and the drones were small and fast and expendable and could be manufactured from raw materials, using the Warden's onboard facilities, so losing 100 drones in combat meant they could be replaced in 48 hours. Lawson continued and said the Council defined a ship as any manned vessel capable of independent operation, but these drones didn't qualify under that definition because technically they were ammunition, not ships. Daniel felt his heart race and asked how many Wardens they could build, and Lawson said they were currently on track for 35, which left room for 15 other specialized vessels, while the rest of the official fleet would be support ships and electronic warfare platforms and mobile defensive installations that technically qualified as ships under Council definitions. Henderson pulled up another schematic and said they were completely reorganizing military doctrine because the Council fought in formation with clear battle lines and predictable tactics that had worked for centuries against species who fought the same way. Daniel said so. Humanity wouldn't fight fair. And Henderson agreed and explained they had been studying every human conflict from guerrilla warfare to modern combined arms operations, because the Council had forgotten what real warfare looked like when both sides were actually trying to win instead of just enforce compliance. General Patricia Hayes appeared on one of the screens from the Mars training facilities and said the ground forces were even more interesting because the Council wanted Earth to reduce to a token peacekeeping force of maybe 50,000 troops total. Daniel guessed they didn't define what a troop was, and Hayes grinned and confirmed that was correct. So they created new classifications called active service personnel versus reserve volunteers, and they would have 50,000 active personnel, fully compliant with Council oversight. But they would also have 15 million trained and equipped volunteers who were technically civilians until activated. Daniel said the entire population was mobilizing, and Hayes confirmed that every able person between 18 and 60 was going through basic combat training, but they called it civil defense preparation. So when Council monitors checked in, they saw people learning first aid and emergency procedures and thought humans were just being paranoid. Lawson said there was something else, and his tone became more serious as he pulled up a file marked with the highest security clearance and explained they had made a breakthrough in propulsion research that Council oversight was supposed to be monitoring. Daniel asked what they found, and Lawson said the Council used quantum fold drives for faster-than-light travel, which was predictable and reliable but limited, to establish jump points while Earth had been reverse engineering captured pirate technology. Lawson explained they called it skip drive technology, and instead of folding space, it phased a vessel partially out of normal spacetime. So the ship technically traveled at slower speeds but experienced time differently, and from outside a skip drive ship appeared to teleport short distances unpredictably. Henderson guessed the Council had banned this technology, and Lawson confirmed they outlawed it 200 years ago, because it was too unstable and too dangerous and too unpredictable, which made it perfect for Earth because drone swarms using skip drives would make Council targeting systems useless. Daniel absorbed all this information and asked when the Council's inspection team would arrive, and Henderson said 2 weeks and they would want to verify compliance and count ships and observe training facilities. Daniel said they would show the inspectors exactly what they expected, to see which was 50 shiny new ships all properly registered, and training facilities full of peacekeeping forces, learning crowd control and disaster response, and a defeated species learning its place. Lawson asked what would really be happening, and Daniel said in reality, they would have 40 operational wardens with drone complements and 15 specialized warfare vessels, and the most combat-ready population in the galaxy, all hiding in plain sight. Hayes spoke from the screen and said, there was still the question of what happened when the Council realized Earth wasn't actually complying. And Daniel said that was where he came in, because he needed to buy time and keep the council confident and dismissive, and convinced that humans were scared children who fell in line. Henderson asked if Daniel could do that for 11 more months, and Daniel thought about the crystalline high arbiter, who radiated absolute confidence in council supremacy, and the 73 species who voted unanimously to threaten Earth, and they were so certain of their righteousness and so secure in their power. Daniel said he could do it, because they wanted to believe it, and the council had spent centuries building a system where the strong dictated terms to the weak, so the idea that a junior species might actually resist effectively didn't make sense to them, and they would see what they expected to see right up until the moment Earth showed them the truth. Christine Baker asked what truth that was, and Daniel's expression hardened as he said that humanity didn't survive to reach the stars by rolling over for bullies, but by being the most stubborn and creative and downright ornery species evolution ever produced. And the council wanted a war, so they would get one, just not the kind they expected. The briefing concluded, and Henderson pulled Daniel aside once more and said, "This all fell apart if the council caught on early, because if they saw through the deception before Earth was ready, they would hit humanity with everything they had." Daniel said he knew that was why he was heading back to the council chambers tomorrow, to be the most compliant and apologetic and humble diplomat they had ever seen, and he would make them believe that breaking Earth was easy. Henderson said, while Earth prepared to show them it was impossible, and Daniel agreed and looked out at the stars where somewhere the vast council fleet could be turned against Earth at any moment. Daniel quoted an old military philosopher and said, "All warfare is based on deception, and when you are able to attack, you must seem unable, and when using forces, you must appear inactive, and when near, you must make the enemy believe you are far away." Henderson asked what happened when they finally realized the truth, and Daniel's smile was cold as he said by then, Earth would already be at their doorstep, and they would learn what every bully in human history had learned, which was that humans don't start fights, but they sure as hell finish them. The council inspection team arrived exactly on schedule in a gleaming vessel that looked more like a government building than a military ship, and Daniel Wright greeted them at the Jupiter Station diplomatic terminal with all the proper bows and respectful gestures that protocol demanded. While inside he felt his nerves wound tight like a spring ready to snap, Commander Vexall led the team, and his multiple limbs moved with precise mechanical efficiency, while beside him floated Observer Ral, who was a junior member of the crystalline Zaxthor species, along with 3 other specialists from species Daniel recognized, but rarely dealt with directly. Vexall's translator turned his chittering into flat, emotionless English as he asked if Earth was prepared for their assessment, and Daniel kept his tone respectful and said completely prepared, because humanity had worked tirelessly to meet the council's requirements, and he thought they would find Earth had exceeded expectations. They started with the primary orbital shipyard above Earth, where Daniel guided them through observation decks, and they could see the reduced fleet with each ship, tagged and registered in the council's database. And there were exactly 50 vessels, just as the mandate required. The Crown-class command ships gleamed under the station lights with fresh Earth Defense Force insignia, and they looked impressive and almost ceremonial with sleek lines and obvious diplomatic accommodations. And what the inspectors couldn't see from their angle was that each Crown-class vessel had been stripped of half its weapons to make room for advanced sensor arrays and communication systems. Observer Ral's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been skepticism as he asked if these were Earth's primary warships, and Daniel confirmed they were and explained they were multi-role vessels designed for patrol and peacekeeping and defensive operations, because Earth had prioritized versatility over raw combat power as the Council suggested. What Daniel didn't mention was that versatility included the ability to coordinate entire swarms of autonomous combat drones, or that their sensor systems could penetrate Council stealth technology that was supposedly undetectable. Commander Vexall consulted his datapad and said he counted 12 Crown-class vessels and asked about the remaining 38 ships. Daniel explained they were distributed across the system for patrol and monitoring duties, and said Earth could provide complete logs of their positions and activities. And there were 15 stationed in the asteroid belt for mining protection, and 8 around Mars, supporting terraforming operations, and 7 in the Kuiper belt, watching for pirate activity. and the rest were on various assignments throughout the system, it was all technically true, because those ships were exactly where Daniel said they were. But what he didn't mention was the massive warden hiding in Jupiter's great red spot using the storm's electromagnetic interference to mask its signature, or the 3 wardens concealed in hollowed asteroids camouflaged to look like mining operations, or the shipyards hidden throughout the system-building components that would be assembled far from Council eyes. The inspection team spent 3 days examining Earth's fleet, and they boarded ships and reviewed maintenance logs and interviewed crew members who had been carefully coached on what to say and what to leave out. And they checked weapon systems and found them adequate but unimpressive by Council standards, and they analyzed defensive capabilities and concluded that Earth had indeed been effectively disarmed. Vexel finally announced that Earth's compliance was noted but said they must also inspect military training facilities and ground forces. Daniel said, of course, and explained they had prepared a tour of the primary training center on Mars. The Mars facility was genuine, with a sprawling complex where 50,000 active service personnel were training in peacekeeping operations and disaster response and civil defense, and the inspectors watched exercises that emphasized de-escalation and crowd control and emergency medical procedures, and everything was clean and professional and entirely non-threatening. What they didn't see were the caverns 20 kilometers below the surface where General Patricia Hayes was drilling 15 million volunteers in combined arms tactics and urban warfare and guerrilla operations, or the civil defense bunkers that honeycombed Mars and Earth and every settled moon in the system, or the weapons caches disguised as emergency supply depots, or the entire shadow military that existed in the space between Council definitions and human creativity. On the 4th day, observer Raoul pulled Daniel aside in a private conference room, and the Zax Thor's crystalline structure refracted light in complex patterns that Daniel had learned. Indicated contemplation, Raoul said. Daniel had been very cooperative, and this was unusual for humans because Council intelligence had suggested that humanity would resist these requirements. Daniel allowed himself a small, sad smile and said, "Some people wanted to resist." But he helped them understand that the Council's way was the only way, and explained that Earth was a young species with much to learn. Raoul said, "Indeed," and there was something in the observer's tone that Daniel couldn't quite read, as he asked if Daniel was certain that Earth had no hidden assets or secret weapons development programs. This was the critical moment, and Daniel met the observer's prismatic gaze without flinching, and said Earth had submitted all research facilities to Council oversight as required, and Dr. Peter Lawson had personally certified that all weapons development had ceased, and they were welcome to verify this themselves. It was another technical truth, because weapons development had ceased, but what had ramped up was advanced defensive systems research and emergency survival technology programs, and half a dozen other initiatives that fell just outside the Council's definition of weapons development, because humanity had become expert at finding spaces between the rules observer. Raoul studied Daniel for a long moment, and Daniel felt his heart rate increase despite his outward calm. But then the Zax Thor pulsed with what the translation matrix rendered as satisfaction and said, Earth's transformation was remarkable, and the Council would be pleased to learn that humanity had accepted its proper place in the galactic order. The inspection team departed 2 days later, and their report praised Earth's unexpected, but welcome, compliance and noted the complete absence of hostile intent, and Commander Vexal even suggested that humanity might serve as an example to other junior species of the benefits of accepting Council guidance. As their ship jumped away through quantum fold, Admiral Kyle Henderson joined Daniel on the observation deck and said quietly that they bought it. And they actually bought the whole deception. Daniel said of course they did because they needed to believe it, and explained that the alternative, which was that a species could actually defy them, effectively would undermine everything the Council had built over 3 centuries, so it was easier to believe Earth rolled over than to question their own assumptions. Henderson asked how long they had, and Daniel checked his chronometer and said 8 months until the Council's deadline expired, but he estimated they had less than that before someone started asking questions, and maybe 6 months before another inspection team arrived, and this one would be more thorough. Henderson said then they would accelerate the timeline, and he would inform President Lisa Morgan that they needed full operational capability in 5 months, not 8. Henderson left to coordinate with the various hidden facilities throughout the solar system. Daniel remained at the viewport watching Earth rotate below, and somewhere down there in cities and towns across the planet, millions of people were training and building and preparing for a war they hoped wouldn't come but knew was inevitable. Daniel thought about Vexal's smug satisfaction, and Raul's condescending praise, and the entire council's absolute certainty that they had tamed humanity, and they had looked at Earth's compliance and seen weakness and surrender and defeat. They hadn't seen the truth, which was that humanity's greatest weapon had always been the ability to make adversaries underestimate them, and to appear beaten while planning victory, and to comply with the letter of the law while violating its spirit in every way that mattered. The Council had declared war when they demanded Earth's disarmament, and they had started the conflict when they threatened invasion, and they just didn't know it. Yet Daniel pulled up a secure communication channel and said this was Ambassador Wright, and the inspection team had departed, and they suspected nothing. Lawson's voice crackled back, asking if that meant they were clear to move to Phase 3. Daniel said, affirmative, and told him to activate all hidden facilities to maximum production, because they had 5 months to build an army that could bloody the nose of the galaxy's strongest military alliance. Lawson repeated 5 months, and asked if they could do it. Daniel smiled, thinking of every underdog victory in human history, and every impossible triumph, and every time humanity had been counted out only to come roaring back, and he said that humans invented the impossible, and 5 months was plenty of time. 4 months had passed since the inspection, and Daniel Wright stood before the Galactic Council once more. But this time the atmosphere was completely different, because the massive chamber was filled with angry voices, demanding explanations and accusations flying through the air like weapons looking for targets. Commander Vexal's translator couldn't quite mask the fury in his chittering as he said Earth had lied to them, and the inspection team had been deceived. And Daniel maintained his calm exterior, though his mind raced through contingency plans because someone had talked or the council had gotten lucky with a patrol that spotted something it shouldn't have, and either way the timetable had just accelerated dramatically. Daniel said carefully that Earth had maintained exactly 50 registered vessels as required by council mandate. The Zaxthor High Arbiter's crystalline form blazed with angry light as it told Daniel not to insult the assembly with technicalities because their intelligence had confirmed the existence of multiple hidden shipyards throughout Earth's system, and humanity had violated the spirit of their agreement. Daniel acknowledged that perhaps they violated the spirit but not the letter, and explained. The Council specified 50 ships and Earth had 50 ships, and they never said anything about manufacturing capacity or defensive platforms or autonomous systems, and the Council assumed Earth would interpret their demands the way they intended, and that was the Council's mistake, not humanity's. The chamber erupted in chaos with several delegates demanding immediate military action, while others called for Daniel's arrest and trial. But Daniel noticed something interesting, which was that not all the species present seemed outraged because some representatives from younger or smaller civilizations were watching, with what looked like satisfaction, and even hope. The High Arbiter raised multiple appendages, and silence gradually fell, and it asked if Daniel admitted to deliberate deception. Daniel said he admitted to following the exact letter of council law, while protecting his species' right to self-defense, and added that many of them would have done the same in Earth's position, if they had the courage that sparked fresh outrage. But Daniel pressed on, and his voice cut through the noise as he said the council had grown comfortable with power and forgotten what it meant to face an opponent who actually fought back, and for 3 centuries they had bullied junior species into submission, convinced that technological advantage and numerical superiority made them invincible. Daniel said, "Congratulations, because they finally pushed a species that pushed back." The Kryn delegate said Earth could not seriously believe it could stand against the combined might of the Council, but there was uncertainty in the translation. Daniel asked if they wanted to stand against the Council and said humanity was going to do better then, that because they were going to teach the Council a lesson that should have been learned centuries ago, which was that might doesn't make right, and that predicting warfare based on past victories was a recipe for catastrophic defeat. He pulled out a small data drive and placed it on the podium and said this contained the location and specifications of every hidden facility the Council was so concerned about, and they should review it at their leisure, because they would find Earth had violated exactly 0 council regulations and every facility was on sovereign Earth territory, and every vessel they built met the technical definition of defensive platform or autonomous system. Under council law, Daniel said, Earth played by the council's rules and they just didn't like the outcome. The High Arbiter's form pulsed with color as it reviewed the data, and Daniel could see the moment when the full scope of Earth's preparations became clear, with 35 wardens each carrying 500 combat drones and 15 specialized warfare vessels with capabilities the Council had never encountered, and defensive platforms throughout the solar system that could turn Earth's home territory into a death trap for any invasion force, and perhaps most shocking, the 15 million trained soldiers waiting to be activated. The High Arbiter finally said this was an act of war, but the certainty in its voice had wavered. Daniel corrected and said no, because the Council's ultimatum was an act of war, and their threat of invasion was an act of war, and humanity simply refused to be victims. And now the Council had a choice to make. Vexel demanded to know what choice, because the Council could crush Earth, and their fleet numbered in the thousands. Daniel interrupted and asked if they really could, and said they should do some math, because the Council had approximately 4,000 combat-capable vessels spread across 73 member worlds, and to concentrate enough force to guarantee victory against Earth's defenses, they would need to pull ships from member systems, leaving them vulnerable. Daniel asked vulnerable to what, and suggested void pirates or other junior species who might be inspired by Earth's example, or perhaps vulnerable to each other. He let that sink in and watched as several delegates exchanged uncertain glances, because the Council's strength had always been unity, but that unity was predicated on fear and mutual defense, and weakened that, and the entire structure became unstable. Daniel continued and said the Council would also need to consider casualties, because Earth's projections suggested that taking their world would cost between 800 and 1,200 ships, plus millions of ground troops, and that was assuming humanity didn't activate certain contingencies they had in place. Daniel asked if the Council could afford those losses, and if they could afford to show the galaxy that junior species could inflict that kind of damage. President Lisa Morgan's face appeared on a screen behind Daniel, broadcast from Earth, and she said the Council had a decision to make, because they could attempt invasion and win a victory that might tear their alliance apart, or they could acknowledge that humanity had the right to defend itself, and they could renegotiate their relationship as equals. The High Arbiter's scorn was palpable as it said, equals, when humanity was barely 3 centuries into spaceflight. Daniel said simply that here they were ready to fight the Council to a standstill, and age didn't guarantee wisdom, because sometimes it just meant they had longer to become set in their ways. Admiral Kyle Henderson appeared on another screen, broadcasting from the command center on Luna, and said all Earth defense forces were at full readiness and their wardens were deployed throughout the system, and their population was mobilized, and he told the Council to come if they must. But understand, this wasn't going to be like subduing the Torvin 3 centuries ago, because humans don't fight wars to prove points but to win them. The chamber had gone quiet, with the initial outrage replaced by uncomfortable calculation, and Daniel could see it happening, which was the slow realization that Earth had changed the equation, because the Council had never faced a species that combined humanity's technological creativity with its historical experience in warfare, and they were used to overwhelming less advanced opponents, not fighting enemies who had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other. A new voice spoke up from a delegate representing the Shen, who were a relatively minor species near the edge of Council territory, and the delegate said, perhaps there was wisdom in negotiation because humanity had proven resourceful, and would it not be better to have them as willing partners rather than resentful subjects? Several other delegates murmured agreement, mostly from smaller species who likely saw parallels to their own situations, and the cracks in Council unity were showing. But the High Arbiter was not ready to concede, and said the Council would not be intimidated by a junior species no matter how cleverly. They had armed themselves, and the Council would vote on military action within one standard cycle, and it told Daniel to prepare his defenses, because Earth would need them. As the session ended and the connection terminated, Daniel found himself alone in the communication room aboard the diplomatic station, and he had known this moment was coming and had prepared for it. But the reality was still sobering. because humanity was about to go to war with a galactic power structure that had dominated known space for centuries. His personal communicator chimed, and it was Dr. Peter Lawson saying they had monitored the session and asking how bad it was. Daniel replied it was about what they expected, because the council was going to vote for invasion, but they weren't unanimous anymore, and some of the younger species were thinking twice about the whole system. Lawson said good because he had something that might help even the odds further, and his face appeared on the screen, grinning as he said, remember that skip drive technology they had been developing, and they just had a breakthrough. Daniel asked how far up they could scale it, and Lawson said, Warden class, because they could make their carriers skip suddenly and unpredictably in ways that council targeting systems couldn't track. And this wasn't just about defensive advantage anymore, but force projection. Lawson said, the council thought they would be fighting Earth in the solar system. But what if humanity took the fight to them? Daniel felt his pulse quicken and asked how soon. Lawson said give them 2 weeks to retrofit the fleet, and after that they would be ready for anything the council threw at them. And maybe a few things the council wasn't ready for. The council fleet emerged from Quantum Fold at the edge of Earth's solar system, with impressive precision and 800 ships representing 12 different species, arrayed in a formation that had conquered worlds for 3 centuries, and at their head, the Council Dreadnought Eternal Justice carried the combined leadership of the invasion force, including High Arbiter Zaxthor itself on. Luna Command Admiral Kyle Henderson watched the fleet's arrival with grim satisfaction and said, they came in exactly where humanity predicted, because they were overconfident and predictable. General Patricia Hayes observed from her position at the tactical console that they were following standard doctrine with forward element screening, the capital ships and support vessels in the rear in perfect formation, and she said they really hadn't fought a war in a long time. Ambassador Daniel Wright stood beside President Lisa Morgan in the command center, watching humanity's fate unfold across a dozen display screens, and Morgan ordered him to give the formal response. Daniel activated the wideband transmission and said this was Ambassador Daniel Wright, representing the United Earth government, and the Council fleet's presence in their system constituted an act of war, and they were ordered to withdraw immediately or face consequences. The High Arbiter's response came within moments saying humanity had violated Council protocols and must face justice, and Earth should surrender its fleet and submit to occupation or be destroyed, and they had 1 standard hour to comply. Daniel replied calmly that the message was noted and the Council had been warned, and he closed the channel and turned to Henderson saying the Admiral could proceed. Henderson's smile was predatory as he said all batteries should execute Swarm Protocol Alpha, because the Council thought they were here to fight a defensive action, and humanity would show them how wrong they were. Throughout, the solar system hidden bays opened, and from asteroids and moon bases and camouflaged platforms, the first wave of Earth's drone swarms launched, with 5,000 autonomous combat units, each no larger than a fighter craft, and each equipped with skip drive technology that made them flicker in and out of normal space. The Council's formation began to shift as their sensors detected the launch, but they were still thinking in terms of traditional warfare, and their point defense systems activated, and their fighters deployed and their capital ships adjusted position to bring weapons to bear on what they assumed would be a conventional missile attack. Then the drones entered skip drive mode, and the battlefield went chaotic. One moment, the swarm was there, and the next individual drones were appearing inside the Council formation, firing and skipping away before return fire could lock on, and their weapons weren't powerful enough to seriously damage capital ships, but they didn't need to be because they targeted sensors and communication arrays and engine clusters, and anything that would degrade the fleet's coordination. Commander Vexal's voice came over the command channel with confusion, evident even through the translator, asking what this was and how the drones were teleporting. One of his sensor officers replied they weren't teleporting but phasing partially out of normal space using skip drive technology. And he thought that was banned. The High Arbiter cut in saying it was banned 3 centuries ago, but humans, it seemed, did not respect Council wisdom. Daniel transmitted back saying, Council wisdom was about to get them killed because Earth offered them a chance to withdraw, and they chose war, and now they should live with the consequences. The second wave launched this time from the Wardens themselves, and the massive carrier vessels hidden throughout the solar system released their full complements with 17,000 more drones joining the battle, and the Council fleet's carefully maintained formation began to break down, as individual ships found themselves overwhelmed by targets they couldn't effectively track or hit. Henderson noted they were adapting as some Council vessels began firing in area saturation patterns rather than trying to target individual drones, and he said, "Smart but not smart enough." He activated a different protocol, telling Warden Group Alpha to execute skip maneuver with target coordinates uploaded and fire on. Arrival 6 of the massive Warden carriers disappeared from their positions throughout the solar system, and they reappeared scattered among the Council fleet's support vessels, with their heavy weapons already charged, and the surprise was total. At point-blank range, the Wardens opened fire, and Council support ships designed for logistics and long-range support, rather than direct combat, began to come apart under the assault, and fuel carriers exploded, and repair vessels fragmented, and command and control vessels found their systems overwhelmed by Earth's electronic warfare suites. The High Arbiter's composure finally cracked as it said impossible, because Earth was supposed to be defending their system, not attacking theirs. Daniel said, conversationally over the open channel, that this was a change in tactics and humans called it offense, and the Council might have heard of it because it was what you did when you weren't content to roll over and die. The Council fleet was now fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, with drone swarms harassing their heavy units and Wardens materializing among their support vessels, and from Earth itself, something new emerged, the ESS Liberty and her sister ships that the Council thought had been scrapped dropped their camouflage and powered up, and they weren't the ships they had been because Dr. Peter Lawson's retrofit had turned them into dedicated electronic warfare platforms, carrying enough jamming equipment to blind and tire. Fleets Henderson said all Council vessels should know their tactical network was about to go dark, and he recommended reverting to local command before their ships started shooting each other. The Liberty activated its systems, and the Council's carefully coordinated battle network dissolved into static, and individual ships suddenly found themselves operating blind, unable to communicate with their command structure, and unable to coordinate targeting or movement. The battle, which had started as an organized invasion, had become a chaotic brawl in less than 30 minutes, and humanity was winning. In the Eternal Justice High Arbiter, Zaxthor watched in growing horror as its fleet fell apart, and casualty reports flooded in with 27 ships destroyed and 64 heavily damaged, and coordination lost across all elements, and Earth's defenders hadn't even committed their heavy units yet. The Arbiter ordered them to pull back and reform at rally point Theta 7 because they needed to regroup, and reassess. Vexall reported they were taking 50% casualties on the withdrawal, because those drones were hunting engines specifically and trying to cripple rather than destroy. So Council ships couldn't retreat. The Arbiter commanded them to fight their way clear, and its crystalline form flickered with colors that indicated fear, not of death but of the implications, because the Council was losing, and the mighty Galactic Council, undisputed rulers of known space for 3 centuries, was being defeated by a species barely 300 cycles into spaceflight. As the Council fleet struggled to disengage, Daniel transmitted one final message saying the High Arbiter should take this opportunity to reconsider its position, because this was just the opening engagement and Earth had barely touched their defensive capabilities, and they hadn't even discussed what happened when humanity started returning the favor and bringing the fight to Council territory. The Arbiter replied they would not dare, but the certainty was gone. Daniel asked if they wouldn't, and his smile was cold as he said, "The Council came here to teach Earth a lesson about its place in the galaxy, and humanity was offering a counter-lesson, which was that humans didn't have a place because they made their own place, and right now they were teaching the Council that age, and numbers didn't guarantee victory, but adaptability did, and innovation did, and the willingness to do whatever it took to survive did." The Arbiter warned this wasn't over. Daniel agreed of course it wasn't, but said here was what would happen next, which was the Council would limp back to Council space with about half the fleet they came here with, and they would explain to other member species how a junior civilization just handed them their first military defeat in 3 centuries, and then they would realize that if Earth could do this, once they could do it again and again, and eventually some of those other junior species the Council had been keeping under their thumb, would start wondering if maybe they could do it too. The Council fleet jumped away in disorder, leaving behind debris and damaged vessels that Earth's recovery teams were already moving to secure, and in the command center a cheer went up from the assembled officers and officials. President Morgan allowed herself a small smile and said they won. Daniel corrected her, saying they won a battle, but the war would be longer and bloodier than this because the Council couldn't afford to let Earth get away with this, and they would be back. Henderson said, "Let them come," as he reviewed damage reports because Earth had lost 300 drones, which were already being replaced in hidden factories, and one warden had taken heavy damage but was repairable, while the Council had lost nearly 100 ships and abandoned a region of space they controlled for centuries.